Okay. Okay, I see the little live thing in the corner there, so it's telling me that I am live. Hello, everybody, and thank you for... Oh, something changed. Am I live now? I hope so. I have to be live now. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me this evening for our Wednesday night study in Leviticus. As you can see, I'm not in the auditorium this evening. I am coming to you live from the sunroom in our apartment. So you get to see the sunroom once again. We are back in Leviticus, and this time we are going to be starting off in chapter 14, or sorry, not chapter 14, chapter 13. Last time we were in Leviticus, we looked at laws concerning. Hello, Annie. We looked at laws concerning clean and unclean animals, and laws concerning sort of a quarantine protocol to follow that Israelite women were to follow after giving birth. And we noted how it was very important. It's very good health practice to. I have this weird strand of hair. Just kind of. Nope, that's the wrong way. Get out of there. It was a very good health practice to let women and newborn children have like at least a week, and even better 2 weeks of time where they are away from everyone. And my phone just binged. They're away from everyone, and they are able to, not have to deal with the various diseases that a human community has. And a human community back then was much less clean than now. Although Israel was a lot more clean than most ancient peoples, particularly because they got all of these laws concerning cleanliness and how to deal with diseases and how to quarantine from God. And what we're going to see, tonight and a few other nights probably, when we get into the book of Numbers, is that God knew about diseases. God knew about diseases, and he knew about them way before we did. I talked about this one Sunday before, talking about, what was his name? Dr. Semmelweis. He's the man accredited with discovering germ theory in 1850-something. But in reality, God understood this matter of germs and diseases and quarantining before anyone else did, because of course he knew. And he communicated this in how to, he didn't communicate germ theory, but he communicated to ancient Israel how to avoid contaminating each other, how to avoid contaminating themselves, and what to do when one of them ends up having a disease like the ones that we're going to talk about tonight, which is, of course, leprosy. In in chapter 13, leprosy is discussed, and something that we're going to need to understand is that when the Bible mentions leprosy, particularly in the Old Testament, it is not specifically meaning the kind of leprosy that we are very familiar with today. Less so familiar with now, because we've almost all but gotten rid of it in the United States. But the one that we're mainly familiar with is called Mycobacterium leprae, or Mycobacterium lepromatosis. It's also known as Hansen's disease. It is the leprosy where it turns your skin either red or white. You break out in red hives, and then if it goes on long enough, you have white flaky skin, and then it starts to fall off. Leprosy is real bad. And in other parts of the world, much like India, leprosy is actually still a semi-common occurrence. And I remember an old preacher friend of mine, he discussed when he was a missionary in India. And the congregations there at the time used 1 cup for the communion, which there's nothing wrong with doing that. But there were lepers, people who were visibly leprous in the congregation. And so he got really nervous when he saw the cup get passed to the lepers, and then he saw what they did, and they actually just, kind of poured it into their mouth. Because because leprosy, as we know it, spreads through fluids. It doesn't spread through coughing or anything like that. Unless you have a really wet cough, then that would be fluids. So he breathed a sigh of relief because they weren't putting their lips on the one cup that the congregation used, and thus they weren't spreading their leprosy. But no, when the Bible mentions leprosy, it doesn't specifically mean that kind of leprosy, the flesh-eating bacteria kind. It means generally any kind of skin disease. That was the general term for skin diseases, any dermatological abnormalities that could be spread to other people. And the term leprosy in this portion of Leviticus gets expanded to more than just skin disease even. You'll see in chapter 14, it gets used in the context of pretty much mold in a house, like inside the walls of a house. That was termed as leprosy in a wall. And also, in the latter half of chapter 13, it mentions leprosy in a garment, so it can be in your clothing. So it's that would probably be talking about mold or mildew. So God understood even that it's not just the big diseases like leprosy, like how we know leprosy, that needs to be addressed. It's also the more indirect things like mold in your house. Having mold in your house can lead to many other type of health concerns. We know that our brother Bobby has very long-lasting respiratory issues, and if he had mold in his house, he would know it real soon, right? It would cause really bad health issues for him. And God knew this. God knew that mold in your house, mildew on your clothes, that wasn't a good thing either. And so procedures needed to be in order to deal with even those kinds of things. And it just kind of demonstrates the knowledge that God had or has, and the fact that even though ancient Israel in no way, shape, or form could have known how to deal with, hey, he's here. Hey, Bobby, I was just talking about you. Even though ancient Israel had no way, shape, or form to be able to know how to deal with these things and what they were and why they were, God still communicated in such a way that he gave them the tools to deal with them. He was very wise, and he's very knowledgeable, and he was really meaning it when he said that if you follow my commandments, you will not experience the diseases and plagues that the other nations experience. And you could say, well, he meant if they follow his commands, he won't send the diseases their way. That's a good way of looking at it. But another way is, it kind of gets a little circular here, but bear with me. If they follow these commands, the diseases won't even happen with them, or they won't spread as much as they would spread in another, just pagan country, pagan nation. So even in that regard, God's commandments do protect them, in this case, from the diseases that other nations around them would be suffering from. Israel was much more clean in that regard than many other nations. So when we look at what the law here says about leprosy, and I'm going to, I'm kind of talking out of my brain here because I left the class notes at the building, and as you can see, I'm not at the building. So if I forgot something important, I'll bring it up next week. But when the Bible talks about leprosy here, it says that in the case of a swelling or a spot erupting, it turns into a case of leprosy, a disease on the skin or the body. Then the person afflicted needs to come before the priests. Nominally, it would be Aaron. He's the high priest, but the other priests can do this too. And the priest is meant to examine the area and determine whether or not it could really be leprosy, a leprous disease. Yes, the priests needed to be dermatologists in ancient Israel. Isn't that a weird thing to think about? They needed to have at least a practical knowledge of dermatology so that they could diagnose whether or not something is a leprous disease. And if the spot is no deeper than the skin and, it doesn't look like it's going to be a real leprous disease, then the priest is told, keep the person quarantined for 7 days. And then at the end of the 7 days, if it goes away or it's been diminished significantly, then it's fine. It's not going to be a real problem. Their body can take care of it. However, if at the end of those 7 days, the case has gotten worse, then it is to be considered a leprous disease. And so probably missing another round of 7 days where they get quarantined. But if it is really a case of leprous disease, then the person is told to go through a purification process. And in that process, we have the water of purification. I don't remember if it's specifically in this chapter or if it is in another one, but we talked about the water of purification before and how it really demonstrates God's foreknowledge of, can you even call it foreknowledge? Because it's just that he knew it and he made it that way. But his knowledge about microscopic disease-causing things and how a lot of ingredients can be used to kill them off. Because the water of purification, it had ingredients such as ashes that were passed through water. And if you know about the American pioneers, you know that way back when they used to use a thing called lye as soap. We still use lye soap very often. And the way that you get that is you burn something that was living, you burn something that had fat on it, and you pass water through the ashes, and the water will contain lye. Now, lye in high quantities is really caustic. It's really irritating. But in smaller quantities, in more diluted solution, it acts as an antibacterial. It's really good soap. And in addition to that, God told them to use oil from cedar wood. Cedar wood is... Oh, I'm freezing up a little bit. Oh, okay. Cedar wood is, if you didn't know, it's anti a lot of things, actually. Mostly people use it as an insecticide. People make cabinets out of cedar wood because it's a natural insecticide, and it'll keep bugs out of your food. But it's also an antifungal. It's also an antiseptic. It's also what was the word? I don't remember the exact word, but it helps clear gunk, mucus, out of your respiratory system. So cedar wood, very interesting that God includes that. You might think, oh, it's just like a ritual kind of thing, but no, it's for very good reasons that he told them to put cedar wood in it. There are a few other things, but another interesting thing to note is that he told them to throw in scarlet wool. The scarlet wool, the threads would disperse into the water, and if you're using the water on your body, it means that you have to scrub really hard to get it off, and so you're ensuring that you are really going to get clean. Like I said, there's a few other ingredients. I'm kind of drawing a blank on them right now. But they all, like wouldn't you know, they all have some really good antibacterial or antiseptic or antifungal uses for them. So if someone has a leprous disease, they got an infection in their skin, they're told to use this purification water for a certain amount of days. And then once they are cured, they are told to go to the priest again, have it checked out. He says, yep, looks good. And then they are told to make a couple of specific sacrifices. One of them, of course, being the burnt offering, because you remember that the burnt offering is for making oneself suitable to enter into the presence of God. And then they're told to make sin offering because you probably did something in the meantime. And I believe there might have also been a peace offering thrown in there, because why would you not want to celebrate the peace that you have between you and God right after a very trying time where you demonstrated that you are willing to follow his commandments in order to be healed. It's very interesting stuff here. That was all in chapter 14. The cleansing, how to cleanse lepers. Now, if the person was a leper, it was very important in the law. They made a really big deal out of it, that they keep away from other people. They would wear clothes to make it obvious that they are a leper. They had particular kinds of clothes. I don't think it was sackcloth. I think it was more along the lines of ripped clothing. So like rags. They would wear these types of clothes to signify to other people, hey, I've got a leprous disease, and as per the law, you guys need to stay away from me. They were also told to live outside the camp. It was not uncommon for the Israelite community to have leper colonies where people who had uncurable cases of leprosy, or leprous diseases rather, would live in a closed community. But if they ever had to go into the congregation of Israel, they were told to, one, keep their mouths covered. Yes, have a facial covering, but they used their hand instead of a piece of cloth. And of course, to keep their mouths covered, kept them from spitting on other people when they speak. Sometimes when you speak, you spit. Some people have overactive salivary glands, and so they spit when they speak. And of course, it would be very important, since leprosy and many leprous diseases are spread through fluids. It's of course very important that you then cover your mouth. They would cover their mouth and their nose. I think particularly the law says that they were to cover their mustache. It's of course in the context of a man, so cover their upper lip, and they were to shout aloud whenever they were going towards a crowd. Leper, I'm a leper. Don't come near me, that kind of thing. So it was very important in the law that diseases such as leprosy were contained, that they did not spread throughout the population, which is very wise, considering how much that kind of concept is affecting our lives right now. It's actually very wise, and something that, you could call it secular society, didn't figure out until a really long time afterwards, until like 1,500 years. 1,500 years? That's not right. 3,500 years, sorry, after the fact. We didn't figure that out, that it's a pretty good idea to keep away from other people when you are inflicted with a disease. There's a similar kind of principle that applies to leprous diseases in clothing and leprous diseases in the walls of a house. If someone finds mildew or mold in a piece of clothing or in a house, they take it to the priest, or they have the priest check it out, because you can't take your house to the priest. So he comes to check it out, and he looks at it and he says, that looks pretty nasty. That looks like a leprous disease. And so there is a procedure of washing and cleansing these things. If it was a garment, they were to wash it in water with the soap mixture. If it was the house, they were to wash it with a specific mixture, and then if that didn't fix it, if that didn't clean it out, they were to remove the plaster off of the wall and then clean it. And if that still didn't do it, then the house gets destroyed. The house was broken down, and all the materials were taken to a particular location and burned, which is really unfortunate if that's your house. But of course, Israel was a very what's the word? It was a collective society. It was a communal society. So you could expect that people would help you rebuild your house. It wouldn't be too big of a deal. Now, if it was a garment and all the washing that was prescribed didn't do a thing to it, then I'm sorry that garment gets burned, because can't risk spreading diseases in the community. It kind of puts forth the idea that the laws concerning quarantining and cleansing, making sure you don't spread diseases to those in your community, on the one hand, lots of people get really irked by having to do such things. They get really fed up with having to change their own behavior for the sake of other people's safety. But when we recall what Jesus said were the greatest commands, the greatest being to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But then he says the second is very much like it. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. And upon these two commands hang the entirety of the law and the prophets. On those two commands, love God and love other people, hang all of the laws. Don't spread diseases when you could, keep from spreading diseases. Don't spread diseases. Why? Because it's simply the loving thing to do, to protect those around you from potentially life-threatening things, or really just life-wrecking things. Even if it's not life-threatening, to prevent them from being inflicted with this disease, that is a loving thing to do. It brings my mind back to the idea of understanding the underlying principles beneath the laws, and really there are underlying principles beneath our laws that some people don't understand. Like, why shouldn't I drive faster than the speed limit? Because the speed limit is there for the protection of the people around you as you drive. I mean, I don't know how much of in a rush you are when you go somewhere, but I don't think me getting there a little bit faster is more important than another human being's life. And there are other things like that. And when you take this mentality and you look at the laws that we have in our society, it suddenly becomes more understandable why God commanded us to obey the laws of the land and to respect the civil authorities, because the laws are in place for the betterment of our fellow citizens, of our fellow human beings. And we should never lose sight of the fact that we have a responsibility to love those who are around us. And loving those who are around us means that we're going to keep them out of harm's way, whether it is from us driving really fast in our cars or us with our potential diseases that we might be carrying. It is important that we love each other enough to kind of protect each other in this regard. So after that, after chapter 14, talking about cleansing leprous diseases, it goes into chapter 15, which talks about laws about bodily discharge. Now, once we get through this, we're going to talk about an overarching principle concerning both leprosy and all diseases and all discharge that we mentioned before, but we didn't get into really depth with. It was kind of a passing remark. But these laws about discharge it's pretty simple. What is a discharge? It's when your body is expelling something. And if you have a discharge, you are to be considered unclean. And depending on the type of discharge, the length of time that you are considered unclean varies. If it's blood, then I believe it's 7 to 14 days. I don't remember which one it was. But if it is mucus, you got a runny nose, it's a day. And if it persists the next day, then you're unclean that day too. Now, remember that being unclean was not a sin. It's not considered a sin per se. But waltzing into the presence of the holy God while you are in a ceremonially unclean state is a sin. That's where the sin is. That is where it becomes highly inappropriate. Because God is holy, and in his presence cannot dwell unholiness, uncleanness, impurity. And so being in an impure state, ceremonially speaking, and waltzing into God's holy presence, that's the sin. That's the big no-no. You can't be doing that. And but just being unclean, sometimes you bleed. Sometimes you bleed. And sometimes you get a runny nose. Is it your fault that you got a runny nose? No, of course not. It's not a sin to have a runny nose. And we're, of course, talking about the context of ancient Israel here. It wasn't a sin to have a runny nose, but it was a sin to have this runny nose and be just going around like you don't have a runny nose, and you're not potentially spreading disease and going into the presence of God in the court of the tabernacle and like nothing's wrong, That's where it becomes a sin. So like I said, the discharges vary from all different things. Anything that you can think of being expelled from your body is included, except for children. Technically, children do get expelled from their mother's body, so they do get kind of counted in principle, which is why there were the laws about after you give birth to a child back in chapter 12, and they involved a similar procedure to these that involve discharges. So the reason why all of these things are considered unclean, be it discharging blood or mucus or anything that you can fill in the blank with, or having a case of leprous diseases, is because they are, like with a lot of the unclean animals, they are associated with death. They are associated with death. It's the same reason why an Israelite could not eat an animal that they found dead, because, of course, it is associated with death. It has been dead and you didn't kill it. Something else did. They are all associated with death. And death being the consequence of sin entering the world means that it does not have a place in God's presence. I guess you could connect that to the fact that in the book of Revelation, when the New Jerusalem comes down, chapters 21 and 22, there is no more death. Death is thrown into the pit, meaning it is abolished. It is no more. And elsewhere in the Bible, death is referred to as an enemy that is to be defeated by Jesus, that is to be put in subjugation to him, into submission to him. Death is not a part of the world that is supposed to last after the new creation, after Jesus takes his people home. It's not going to exist because it did not exist in the first place. That gets into a whole discussion of, well, could people die at the beginning because they had to partake of the tree of life in order to live forever, says Genesis 3. So could they technically have died? Well, I guess, but the tree of life was there available for them. And as the Bible puts it in Revelation, the tree of life is going to be available then. So no death. Death is a consequence of sin entering the world. Just look at Genesis chapter 3. When God confronts Adam and Eve, he then takes away the tree of life, or at least he bars them from getting to it, right? So essentially he takes it away from them. He banishes them from Eden, and they are basically condemned to die. Eventually, Adam lived 900 years, but he eventually died because death is a consequence of sin. As Paul puts it, the wages of sin is death. He's not just meaning that in the terms of if you do wrong things, you'll get yourself killed. He's meaning that in a cosmological sense, that death entered the world because sin entered the world. And if sin reigns in your life, then death is going to reign in your life. Now, because all of these things are connected with death, discharge is connected with death because it is considered your body expelling some of its life essence, expelling a part of itself. So blood, the mucus, the waste products, the fill in the blank. It is your body expelling a part of itself. And that also applies to when you give birth to children too, because that child was at one point in you, and then your body expelled him/her. So that is why that is included in the general principle as well. So that's why all of these things are considered unclean. That's why they all have purification processes or quarantine processes. And apart from that, you of course have the health reasons, because there are a number of diseases that can be carried in things that your body expels. One of the main ways that the common cold spreads is that it makes you sneeze and cough. And when you do that, droplets get expelled and they find their way into other people. So keep away from other people when you are sick, and then you will not get them sick. That is why God says the person is to be considered unclean, and they are to, sort of shut themselves in, because don't spread diseases. Of course, there's a symbolic aspect as well, that discharges are connected with death. But the practical aspect is don't spread diseases. And it is very practical. So that is going to close us off for this evening. I want to thank everybody for joining me this evening here in the sunroom. It's not very sunny. It's actually very dark, because it's winter. But thank you for joining me all the same. Next week, we are going to get on to the central focal point of the book of Leviticus. We are about halfway through, and that is the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement takes up chapters 16 and 17. So if you will, in your own time between now and next Wednesday, please read those chapters, look through them carefully. You won't need to read past verse 10 of chapter 17. The Day of Atonement things end at verse 9. But chapter 16 to chapter 17, verse 9, that is what I guess is your homework to read that, and we will talk about that next week. So again, thank you for joining me this evening. I hope everyone stays safe and stays healthy, and God bless you all. Have a good night.